Hello, and welcome back. So, as we continue with the course, now that we've gone through, I think maybe some of the what we could characterize as real kind of basic psychology things, we've talked about perceptual abilities and some physical aging and some basic cognitive aging. And by basic cognitive aging, I mean specifically, talking about attention and memory as if they're just kind of simple cognitive processes. But I think we also want to try to move into the bigger picture a little bit, and that means higher level psychological concepts to talk about here, and how this affects our overall life. So intelligence is next on the menu here, but what we're also going to transition to is to talk about wisdom. And of course, the focus here is on aging. So we're going to have maybe a little bit to say about intelligence in childhood, just to give a little bit of context about what we know about intelligence, because a lot of that research comes from childhood, but we want to then transition into adulthood. First question to ask is what is intelligence? And this is where it gets tricky. This ever since intelligence testing has been a thing, people have debated exactly how to test it, what kinds of questions and scales and measurements need to be included to provide a valid intelligence test. Um, it could, how one way to do it is to just sort of measure how much someone knows, right? We tend to think that a person who we would label intelligent probably knows a lot of things. Can we quantify that somehow? Not really. Uh, of course, what the concern here is that even when people know a lot of things, they don't necessarily know everything. So how do we know what are the things they know and what are the things they don't know? How many kind of it's like giving someone a big academic test, right? That covers every possible subject in the world and so forth. And so this is not even practical. Rather, maybe it's better to think of intelligence from the perspective of solving problems. Right, you're faced with a problem. You have to figure out how to solve the problem, and there's two kind of relevant parameters here. One of these parameters is simply being able to solve a problem that you have been taught how to solve. And what we're getting at here is the idea that this means that you are amenable to teaching and learning, right? That you can go to school, you can learn how to solve problems as they are taught to you in school, and then you can perform when you are tested, just like you do in school, right? So math problems are a kind of problem, right? But again, this is a very limited way of thinking about human problem solving abilities, right? We certainly do need to solve math problems in regular everyday life, but that's really maybe a relatively recent thing. And when we think about human evolution, right? Thousands of years ago, how much math did people need to solve? Does that mean they didn't know math and therefore they didn't have high intelligence? No, that's really not true at all. But they're still able to solve problems, regular everyday problems, right? And so if we're going to move away from what we might consider to be academic problem solving to other real life academic, or not, sorry, just real life problems, what are those exactly? And how do we select a good set of these kinds of real life problems and put them into a test and then score your performance on them? What makes this even harder is that, as we're going to see as we get into these notes, some of the problems that people are good at solving don't have clear-cut right or wrong answers. Or at least we don't necessarily know whether the solution they have given is right or wrong, maybe for a very long time. A lot of times, think of a simple situation here, maybe one that you've all faced, which is picking a major for college. You're faced with a lot of choices and a lot of factors and a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty, and you do your best to make a choice. And you made the choice, perhaps. You don't get immediate feedback about whether that's right or wrong, like when you're taking a test in school, right? When do you find out if it was the right choice. Maybe it's in your first year and you start taking courses in the major. Maybe it's in your second year when you take a few more courses in your major. Or maybe it's when you graduate. But then what happens? Do you go to grad school? Do you get a job? Is that when you know? When do you know? And so what we're going to see here is that life is full of these kinds of problems. In fact, it might be the case that it's really more about those kinds of things than the things that we do in school. How do we measure that? Another thing to think about here is our decision making and judgment. So, what do I mean by this? This is a little different than problem solving, but it's pretty close, pretty aligned. Um, you might be familiar with the idea that people are infamous for their irrationality, that we are prone to a variety of judgment biases. And if I'm trying to judge the likelihood of something happening and use that to make a decision, that my ability to make such kinds of estimates of the likelihoods of things, right, our reasoning with probabilities and things like this is very poor. And we tend to overestimate likelihoods based on things like our beliefs, and therefore we have kind of like a confirmation bias, and also how easy it is for us to remember certain kinds of events. We'll call that the availability bias. And so you may have heard of these kinds of things, especially from a cognitive psych course: the representativeness bias, the availability bias, the confirmation bias, the anchoring bias, and so on and so forth. I have a little bit more to say later on in these notes about those topics specifically, but we're going to try to avoid just repeating all of a cognitive psych class on that. So, assuming then we have settled on measuring intelligence, right? We have therefore developed an IQ test, right? Then that means that we're going to get something that gives us a number, right? You can have an IQ of 100, or if you're going to be smarter, you can have an IQ of 120 or 130 or something like that. So we can measure it, we can quantify it. And then one thing that I like to think about is, what does that mean to quantify intelligence, right? Is intelligence this sort of thing that you can have in varying amounts, and therefore we can put a number on it, and it's somehow meaningful to say that one person has more intelligence than another person? That would suggest that it is a quantity, right, and a quantifiable thing, as opposed to a quality, right? So a quality is just something that you have this or you have that. It's like having a personality trait of you're extroverted or introverted. Those could be qualities. Of course, we can try to quantify that as well to suggest that they exist on some sort of continuous scale of an extroversion, introversion dimension, right? But again, this is the funny thing about psychology. In this is what William James, by the way, referred to as the psychologist's fallacy, that just because we can imagine that it is possible to do something, right, and say something about some psychological process doesn't mean that it's true what we have imagined. And as psychologists, we have a tendency to think, maybe overthink some of these psychological constructs. So just because we can imagine the possibility of quantifying intelligence doesn't mean that it's a valid thing to actually do. Well, anyway, let's not linger over these academic debates here. Sorry, I'm always messing with my light that just wants to shut off because it can't see me moving. We do have a way of measuring intelligence. We have IQ tests. We measure IQ tests in children largely for academic reasons, but we can also measure adult intelligence. And this is where the Wechsler scale comes in, or WAIS, right? The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It has these 4 subscales that measure different components of reasoning skills and problem-solving abilities and overall knowledge. So verbal comprehension and verbal ability, all right? So the ability to not just read and write, but to understand language, to understand subtlety and complexity in language. Perceptual reasoning involves our abilities, sort of like spatial abilities, and to recognize patterns, visual patterns in stimuli. Working memory capacity is just your ability to hold and manipulate information in your working memory system. And processing speed, as it may sound, is just how fast can you process the information. One thing we might ask is that I have already indicated that we measure IQ in children primarily for educational reasons. In fact, IQ testing was invented for that exact reason. Researchers and educational psychologists in the early days of intelligence measurement were concerned about identifying children who were struggling academically and therefore needed some sort of intervention, special ed type of interventions. And of course, later on, it became also about identifying kids who were very advanced and maybe needed some sort of gifting education interventions. And so we'll call that educational placement. And so IQ was invented for that purpose. And one of the things that we start to notice is that, well, it's very predictive of academic performance, right? So if I know that a kid has got a high IQ, then I can predict with a pretty reasonable degree of certainty that they will be successful in school. I can predict their level of highest degree achieved, right? I can predict their likelihood of completing high school and their likelihood of going to, completing college if they go, or even completing a more advanced degree beyond that. We can predict their performance on various other standardized tests like the SAT or ACT or even the LSAT or GRE or MCAT or any of these kinds of standardized tests. They all correlate pretty well with IQ. Obviously, they measure certain kinds of factual knowledge as well, so you need to know that, but certainly IQ is going to still have a predictive relevance to all of this. And once we start measuring IQ, one of the things that we observe right off the bat here is that it stays pretty stable across the lifespan. And this leads us to believe in the concept often referred to as G, right? This kind of overall general intelligence that might, in fact, even be largely genetic, though I want to try to stay away from these nature-nurture debates in this class. But what we see is it is pretty stable, and it suggests that it's not particularly a function of one's life experiences or even of aging. Although it may be fair to say that once we administer tests like the WAIS to older adults, performance does decline a little bit. This could have some things to do with declines in working memory and processing speed that we covered in the last couple of chapters. So that might be an explanation of this. But again, the question is, why do we even care about measuring intelligence or IQ in adulthood? And we see here that what happened is that if it was so successful in educational placement, can we use it in other similar contexts like job placement? So is it useful to administer an IQ test if I'm hiring for particular jobs that might require complex reasoning abilities, right? If the job doesn't require much thinking, maybe I don't care. But if the job requires something that's more complex reasoning, planning, problem-solving abilities, maybe I want to know who's good at that. Even as early as World War I, we began administering IQ tests en masse to recruits, military recruits, to identify those who might be better suited for higher level, positions and officer training and all that sort of stuff. And so, and it's still, right, there's still these kinds of tests that are used for admission to military and officer training schools and all these sorts of things. So it could still be useful for this kind of placement again, right? But worth noting that this is just one narrow slice of life, and therefore there are lots of things that intelligence does not predict, like someone's overall happiness and life satisfaction, doesn't particularly predict the quality of their relationships and their social skills. Practical decision making. So what is this? This could mean things like, I'm going to make a decision about how to manage my finances and whether to spend money on this or that, and whether I'm going to order food or whether I'm going to cook at home. These are practical decisions, and sometimes, as you probably know, ordering food's getting more and more expensive, and it makes it maybe a bigger strain on your finances. But because of circumstances and fatigue and other kinds of things, we might simply just give in and say, I'm just going to order food. I know it costs too much, but I'm too tired to cook and all these things. That's practical decision making. And just because someone has a high or low IQ doesn't necessarily mean that they are better or worse at these kinds of situations. Maybe everybody falls prone to these kinds of situations, sometimes that are not always maybe the most ideal and optimal choice. This kind of refers back to what I was suggesting when we were talking about decision-making biases and judgment biases, right? Moral reasoning, right? So is IQ predictive of one's morality and ability to make moral judgments and moral decisions? And the answer is no. This is a controversial position because in the early 20th century, there were many researchers who believed that in order for someone to be a moral agent, you had to have some minimum IQ. We don't particularly believe that anymore. And what about wisdom? Well, we're going to talk more about wisdom at the end of these notes. So I'm just going to say here, IQ is not really the same as wisdom. And we'll save that for defining what that is towards the end here. Now, I said earlier about problems not having clear-cut right or wrong answers, and definitely not necessarily immediate feedback about that. These are what we call ill-defined problems. So our example of choosing a major is one of those. Choosing a career is likewise one of those situations here. We have all kinds of conflicts with others in our lives at various times. How do we appropriately handle and manage that conflict and communicate our problems to others? Sometimes when we get older, we may have to care for a loved one who is perhaps experiencing chronic illness, and there are a variety of very complex challenges that one's faced with when trying to be a caregiver. When it comes to the financial strain, the strain on other domains of your life, the change in your relationship role with that person, the new demands of trying to keep track of a lot of the medical and other logistical things going on with that person. These are very complex challenges. These are the kinds of things that you're never taught how to do in school. Being able to figure this out and wing it, it's kind of like being a parent too, right? People say this all the time that no one ever, there's no classes. Well, there are, I guess, but we don't normally go through any kind of parenting class or training, right? We just have babies and then we wing it, right, and hope that we do okay. We got to figure it out as we go. Um, these are all ill-defined problems, right? By ill-defined, I would contrast that with a well-defined problem, because a well-defined problem is one where there's a clear-cut way of solving it with a clear-cut right or wrong answer. Math problems, again, to go back to that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a well-defined problem. We know how the rules of addition and the concept behind quantities, and so there is a procedure that you can follow. When you are given math problems, there is an algorithm that you can learn and a procedure that you follow that gives you the ability to solve that. And there are definitive right and wrong answers, right? But this is not the case for all these other things. And so, again, we're trying to draw a boundary here between intelligence as an academic skill versus intelligence as this ability to deal with these more complicated life problems. So this might mean that we want to go beyond our standard concept of IQ as an academic thing and move into some other ways of thinking and conceiving of intelligence. First thing I want to suggest here is that, well, I just said that IQ is pretty stable over the lifespan, not accounting for some late life declines in processing speed and working memory, but is it possible that there's a little more going on kind of behind the scenes that is not quite as stable as things appear? What if we take the concept of intelligence and divide it into two kinds of intelligences here, crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence? And one thing we can say right off the bat is that crystallized intelligence can increase the older we get. Fluid intelligence may decrease the older we get. And if these increase or decrease at more or less the same rate, what does that tell us? It would tell us that they cancel each other out in a way, that gains in one are offset by losses in the other. And this could give the illusion of a stable IQ, but kind of behind the curtains a little bit, there's something going on, right? There's changes happening, and maybe it's better to look at it this way so that we can understand those changes and figure out how does human reasoning change over the lifespan. Let's first define crystallized intelligence here, right? I have it written out, knowledge of facts, vocabulary, like not just the meaning of words, facts, but some people have a kind of very simple vocabulary, others have a much more rich, complicated vocabulary, but we can learn and we can increase our vocabulary and learn how to talk all fancy and everything, right? But and that we don't necessarily lose that, right? So we can continue to acquire that kind of knowledge and gain and add to that over our lifespan. We can also think about expertise and skill. There is that old adage that you can't teach a dog new tricks, and let's just dismiss that right off the bat. Obviously, yeah, we can learn new things across our entire lifespan and therefore continue to accumulate skills and learn new things. But this issue of expertise is worth unpacking just a little bit more, because separate from learning something brand new somewhere in your mid to late adulthood years, we can also think about a skill that you have acquired in your early adulthood years or even childhood that you continue to dedicate time and practice and effort at, so that you get better and better and better. And at some point, you become what we will call an expert at that. Might not necessarily have to happen until, in your later years. It could happen early, but expertise is something that is another kind of concept that is, here I am waving still, hard to define. We're going to have a little more detail again a little later in the notes on what expertise is and how we're going to define it and understand it. So what we see here is that when we look at the WAIS, the verbal comprehension subscale seems to align pretty closely to these kinds of things that I'm describing here as crystallized intelligence. And meanwhile, fluid intelligence is all this other stuff, right? So solving novel problems. This means, you know, not we have to be careful what I mean by novelty here. So I said before, 2 + 2 is a problem. That's not a novel problem. You know the answer. You've been taught the answer to that problem. But what about something a little bigger? Like, what is 747 times 1,262? I don't know the answer to that. That could be a novel problem to the extent that I've never done that specific multiplication before, right? So I don't know the answer, but it's not novel to the extent that I know how to solve it, right? I can get out a pen and pencil and paper and follow the rules that I have learned, and I can solve that. So that's not a novel problem. Novel problems are the kinds of problems we've never been taught how to solve. This is the stuff, again, that I was talking about, choosing careers and being a caregiver and having children. And these are the things that there aren't necessarily a set of simple rules that we can learn and apply directly to these things. What we find is that this seems to overlap some of those other skills, like working memory, right? So fluid reasoning requires maybe the ability to keep information active in your working memory and to manipulate that information. That's going to interact with processing speed. We talked about that when talking about declines in working memory or associated with slower processing speed in the previous chapter. And maybe some of that spatial perceptual reasoning stuff might also be declining. And so fluid intelligence, as we're going to see, this kind of flexibility and creative kind of thinking, this is declining as we get older. So there's something, right? Some changes here. But again, maybe we can go a little further when it comes to talking about different kinds of intelligence. And this is where Sternberg comes in. So Sternberg now proposes 3 kinds of intelligence, and we'll call it then the triarchic theory as a result of that. First one is analytical intelligence. And again, this is mostly traditional IQ, or at least pretty closely aligned to crystallized intelligence. So again, it's kind of these solving academic problems, well-defined problems. You can learn and you can apply your learning to the appropriate situation. And then there's this creative experiential kind of intelligence where it's novelty. So kind of aligns a little bit to fluid intelligence. But where Sternberg is really kind of getting into something interesting here is the contextual intelligence, sometimes called practical, but I like contextual. His argument here is that we learn problem-solving skills, and therefore we demonstrate our intelligence always in different contexts, especially in cultural contexts. A big part of Sternberg's career involved traveling around the world and observing children in different cultures and the kinds of educational experiences that they go through. And what he finds is that in a lot of Western environments, children go to school at a specific age and they spend a certain number of years in school, and therefore they are exposed to all of these kinds of academic classroom problems that they get taught how to solve. And that's the kind of stuff that is showing up in analytical intelligence. And it was be a surprise to maybe no one with any amount of simple reflection on this, that if I tried to administer a traditional IQ test to kids from some other country who don't have that kind of traditional academic experience, that they might not do very well. And this would suggest then that, again, what that kind of test is measuring a different kind of intelligence than what we're seeing with these kids from these other cultures, where in these other cultures, they're learning things like how to adapt to their environment. All right, the environment has a lot of demands on food, right? How do you get food in your environment? How do you make sure, for example, not just that you can go find food somewhere, but how do you make sure that the social group that you are living in can maintain their access to food, that what you're doing is sustainable, and that you're going to have food over some foreseeable future time span. This requires understanding the world around you and solving problems related to these kinds of ecological um, and agricultural kinds of challenges that you're faced with here, right? So this is adaptation, right? How to fit your environment and how to function appropriately in your environment and solve the kinds of problems that are unique or contextualized to your environment, right? So the survival component there is part of that, but your relationships, right? Because we have social problems that we have to learn how to solve and conflict within our social groups. And this probably looks very different from culture to culture. And there are, of course, different kinds of social rituals and things that we go through in different parts of our lives, right? So, in a Western environment, the fact that there are rituals that we experience in childhood about things like going to school and going through graduations and going to colleges and getting married and all these things. These are the kinds of social rituals that we're used to, but they might look very different in different kinds of things in other environments. All right. Changes the light in here and that makes it so the whole camera thing doesn't work when that light goes off. Sorry, I keep waving like a crazy person here. Shaping. This is pretty relevant, right? So we need to be able to change the environment to suit our needs. So what I'm getting at here is the idea that obviously, yes, if we're going to engage in any kind of agricultural practices, that means we are changing our environment in terms of the kind of food that it provides us. That obviously has to be done within certain constraints, right? What kinds of crops can grow and how do we need to manage that? We also need to create shelter for ourselves and okay, sorry about that. I think my audio cut off for a second. So let me just back up and make sure that we have covered um, the adaptation, right? So we have to adapt to our environment. Um, and then there is changing the environment to suit our needs, growing food, building creating our built environment for shelter, finding environments that fit our needs. Sometimes we may need to move, right? And so being able to find the right place, we could call it finding your niche, right? The idea is that we're going to find the place that fits us very well and where we fit in and makes a lot of sense for us. Now, this kind of intelligence is oftentimes called street smarts, but I think maybe it's better sometimes to use this other phrase. Street smarts to me, I just kind of get the sense of this only applying to um like literally like just on the streets interacting with strangers and so forth. Um, but ecological competence, right? How do I function in my environment? What's that all about here? So let's extend the concept into cultural and ecological competence. So let's have an example here, right? So the first question to ask is we got person A and person B. Person A has a high IQ, as measured by traditional IQ tests. They've done well in school. They've gone all the way through school, college, and even got a PhD. But maybe they're like what I described earlier. They don't necessarily always make great judgments with their personal finances and spending, so they're struggling like that. And maybe also maybe they have some relationship problems as well. Person B, on the other hand, has a maybe just slightly below average IQ, right? So if average IQ is 100, let's say 90, right? So it's just a little below the average. And therefore, they got a high school diploma but did not go to college. But then they have managed to open a small business that is a successful small business that they are now running. They can correctly manage their employees and manage the finances of the business, deal with suppliers and order their supplies and pay those suppliers as needed, and also respond to their customers and provide whatever service or product for their customers. So, which one of these people is more intelligent? And well, you might have a tendency to think if it's just about IQ, then it's person A. But again, we see that person B tends to be the one who seems to do well in these other kinds of non-academic kinds of environments, and person A is not doing that. So we might suggest that person B has higher cultural competence or ecological competence, right? They function well in the environment that they are living in, and person A maybe is not. So that then, of course, suggests that there's something going on with intelligence, right? That's a little bit more than IQ. And just have a list here of these various what we'll call culturally specific examples of competence, right? So relates to this ecological competence, the again, finding food and knowing how to deal with that, being able to, if your crops are failing, you can recognize what's going on with it and you know what to do about it. You know how to manage the plant's needs for water based on variations in climate. Like if it's not raining for a long time, what do you need to do about that? If it's really hot or if it's really cold for a long time, what do you need to do about that in terms of your plants, right? These are problems that people who are living more of an agricultural lifestyle will need to figure out how to solve, and they learn how to solve these things even without going to school. I'm well aware that you can go to an agricultural university and learn a lot of science behind agriculture, but a lot of people all across the world have no such education, and they still manage to grow, of course, quite well. Negotiating with people that you trade with in an urban environment, public transportation, bus schedules, bus routes, subway schedules, and all that sort of stuff can be pretty complicated. So navigating that, of course, is a challenge that you don't necessarily have a class for that. I've already mentioned managing your finances, fixing problems with your tools that you use in your job, your cars, tractors, anything like that, and maintaining your social networks and connecting, because our social networks support us, right? They they're important to us. They give us opportunities, and they buffer us from stress and emotional concerns. So that requires a kind of problem solving as well to deal with the kinds of social problems that we will come up with here. So this is where we can think again. If I come back to the previous slide on contextual intelligence, this is a way of thinking about human intelligence that is distinct from academic stuff here. And this all then culminates in this idea of, well, if intelligence is so variable and so context specific, does that mean that we can look at people who have, not just across cultures, but just even within a culture, look at people who have different levels of abilities or skills and treat that all as a form of intelligence? This is where Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence comes in, so that when we think of something like linguistic intelligence, which may overlap some of the crystallized verbal stuff we've already talked about here, we will describe this as a skill related to our use of language, and then talk about people in occupations like a writer or a lawyer or a teacher who need to be able to communicate or persuade even effectively, journalists too, that that's a form of intelligence that they have, right? Logical mathematical intelligence, right? Being able to understand math and logic and science and abstractions. And so again, when we see people who are scientists and engineers and mathematicians, that's a form of intelligence that they have that maybe other people don't. Spatial intelligence relates to understanding spatial relationships and maybe even also the quality and detail of one's mental imagery. Um, and so here we can think of architects who need to be able to plan, you're creating an architectural plan of a building, but you're visualizing it as a 3D building, but you're drawing it in 2D, right, as you draft it. Pilots certainly have to deal with the movement of their crafts through three-dimensional space. Surgeons may have to deal with this as well. Think about a lot of surgeries are done with laparoscopic cameras, and so you have to control the endpoint of this camera, and you're seeing everything on a screen, and it's kind of 2D and flat, but you still have to understand where your surgical tools are, and that's really a three-dimensional thing. And sometimes things get inverted and turned upside down, and you have to perform these mental representations. It's pretty spatially challenging. Again, musical intelligence, right? Some people are really, really good at music. They understand musical patterns, musical intervals that communicate different kinds of moods, major scales and minor scales, and all that kind of stuff. So they recognize all of that and the rhythms too. And then they're naturally good at playing musical instruments and writing music. And other people just don't have that, right? Bodily kinesthetic. So again, we can think of athletes and dancers who are really good at performing very complex, difficult physical movements with their bodies. The Olympic level athletes, right? Think of some of the stuff that Olympic gymnasts have to be able to do, and the kind of skill they have at performing very specific and difficult movements. Is that a form of intelligence? I mentioned surgeons again, because obviously the level of precision to do certain things is pretty important as well. And of course, craftspeople, those who actually make things, right? A woodworker of some sort, perhaps. And then we have interpersonal intelligence and my ability to understand other people. This relates to some of those social skills before, understanding others' emotions and intentions. So anyone who has to work effectively with other people, again, teachers, a therapist, maybe a politician, or even in sales, right? And then there's intrapersonal, meaning thinking about yourself here and understanding yourself, being good at introspection. And maybe philosophers or even a psychologist, as long as we don't fall prone to the psychologist fallacy that I talked about. Writers need to understand the characters that they write about, so maybe there's some self-understanding there. And maybe even those engaged in more of spiritual pursuits perhaps need that kind of intelligence. Real quick, let me add a little bit more. So those were the original ideas behind Gardner's multiple intelligences, but he has added to this slightly more recently. The first edition is the concept of naturalistic intelligence. And this, again, relates to some of this ecological competence that I'm talking about, right? The ability to sort of recognize patterns in nature. So this is kind of like the musician, right? The musician recognizes patterns in the musical notes, and how that works and how that functions within a musical context. But a really successful farmer can recognize patterns in their plants that they are growing or in changes in the soil that they are noticing. And they understand the meaning of it, and they're very in tune with all of that. So we, again, might treat that as another form of intelligence. It's certainly a type of skill that they have acquired in this particular context. And then last, this one is very tentative. Even Gardner is still waffling whether to include it as a part of the theory. Existential intelligence means just a kind of a good sensitivity and understanding of those deep questions about life and death and existence and all of that. So again, we'll go to the philosophers and the spiritual leaders who are good in these areas to say that maybe that's a form of intelligence that makes them good at understanding those problems that maybe the rest of us don't necessarily get to the level that they do. So this all takes us to the idea that intelligence is so much more than the kind of IQ testing that we do in school. But is this valid to just keep sort of branching out and dividing intelligence into a bunch of different kinds of skills? And maybe that tends to lose the flavor of what was originally meant by the concept of IQ as some sort of broad overarching ability to just solve problems in general. And now what we have done with Gardner here is we've kind of splintered it out into a bunch of domain specific skills. And domain specificity might be important, but there might be a difference between intelligence, broadly writ, versus domain specific skills, which could relate to the concept of expertise that I want to get to coming up in a couple of slides here. So, what's the status in psychology of Gardner's theory here? Well, it remains popular in educational settings because of the idea that if people differ in the kinds of domain specific skills that they have, then this might mean that they learn differently. And so this is part of a trend towards learning styles. Properly, a lot of the learning styles research comes from other lines of work, like from Carol Dweck, who gave us the learning style ideas. But certainly it is consistent with this kind of thinking, and therefore it is still popularly adopted within educational settings, and school psychologists certainly it would then motivate taking a multidimensional approach and a multimodal approach to education, right? The visual presentations and auditory presentations and all that sort of stuff. And yes, maybe it does help us understand the nature of individual differences in talent and skill. Um, there's a lot of research, and I don't necessarily want to go down this rabbit hole for this class, but the idea is that um, some people think that kids are mostly a blank slate, right? And that all we need to do is uh, take a child when they're very, very young and immerse them in something, whether it's athletics or music or whatever, dance or whatever it might be. And we can make them a great expert at this if we just start them young enough. And it turns out the research does not support this idea that maybe people have sort of vaguely innate dispositions towards certain things. So what works better is that when you're given lots of opportunities in childhood to sort of find that thing that you fit well, right? You can try music and then you can try sports and you can try all these other things. And across all of this stuff, eventually, once you have enough of these opportunities, you will find the one that you connect with the most. And then suddenly you'll start to flourish very much in that. And so, again, that kind of helps us understand that there are these kinds of individual differences here. But scientifically, though, the idea is that it's really hard to support a claim that these are real forms of intelligence. Um, the idea is that we don't have good tests for them. And certainly, standard IQ tests are not going to be easily, and performance on IQ tests is not easily divisible onto these various, specific types of intelligence that Gardner has given us here. And part of the problem here is that the definitions of all of these things are pretty subjective, and what's the difference, for example, between interpersonal and intrapersonal, besides just this idea of awareness of others and sensitivity to others versus self-awareness? But certainly self and others are it's a highly interconnected kind of a situation here. So why do we need to put that boundary between them? Is this just an arbitrary cutoff that kind of makes sense depending on how you think about it, but maybe it doesn't? And so once we start to realize that these kinds of boundaries between the types of intelligence are not so well defined, then that means that again we're left questioning to what extent this list is even accurate in the first place. It's also worth asking whether or not these are really forms of intelligence, or are they even something else like personality traits, right? So, especially when it comes to something like the maybe something like the musical one, it might just simply be that it's an interest, right? I really like music, or I really don't care about music, and this is just part of a trait that I have. It's not my intelligence. It's something else entirely. All right, so now what we need to do is we need to transition into other ways of using intelligence. We want to talk about expertise and we want to talk about wisdom, but I think that this video is long enough. So what I want to do is I'm going to stop it right here, and I will make this a two-part video, and we will continue on with the second part next time.